Hello my tech friends, welcome to Budget vs Beast episode 2, the series where we take two similar products within a category, both a premium and a budget focused option, to compare them against one another and ask the question, is it worth spending the extra money? So in today's episode we're going to answer that question with a couple of the best 240mm AIOs within their respective price ranges. So which ones do we have today? Well, we have the $160 Corsair H100i Platinum fighting in our Beast corner, facing off against our budget boy, the $90 ZoomFlow 240x ARGB supplied by ID-Cooling. I'll link them both in the video description for you, but with a price difference of $70, which is enough to potentially bump you up a whole tier of GPU upgrade, which one should you go for? The 240mm closed loop liquid cooler you want, or the one that your wallet would be happier with? And to help us answer that question, I'm going to talk you through the specs and the unboxing before we review them against one another in the following categories: the looks of the coolers, the installation process, the RGB and software control, and then finally a comprehensive performance test including stock, overclocked and fan normalized benchmarks. And stay tuned to the end because we're going to wrap up this video by scoring them in each of those categories and answer the question, which one deserves your money? And who should you listen to? Your wallet or your heart? So if you're not subscribed, why not join our TechLens community and click that notification button to make sure that you don't miss the next Budget vs Beast episode, or my upcoming completely overkill NCase M1 personal rig build. So Budget vs Beast episode 2, let's get into this. So before we go into the categories, let's go over what you get in the box, some of the specs, and the differences between the Corsair H100i RGB Platinum and the ID-Cooling ZoomFlow 240x ARGB, as they look very similar on paper, but that doesn't really tell the full story. The packaging for both includes the radiator pump block combo, the mounting plates for all of the compatible socket types, the additional mounting hardware in these bags, and the fans, which we will circulate back to in a sec. The H100i Platinum has a 5-year warranty and also comes with a micro USB to internal USB cable for controlling the unit through iCUE, and also comes with enough screws for push-pull if you wanted to add some fans later, which I'm really happy to see. The ZoomFlow 240x ARGB has a 2-year warranty and comes with some additional extras as well, namely the ARGB controller for those who can't use their motherboards to control the RGB. Also a 4-way 3-pin 50/50 splitter, a GB motherboard RGB adapter, and there's also some thermal paste and a 4-pin PWM splitter in the mounting hardware bag. So let me take you through a tour of the units, and starting with the radiator, the dimensions are almost identical, with only about 1 millimeter or 2 difference in any directional measurement. But where the differences start to become a bit more visible is in the fans. The H100i Platinum comes with Corsair ML120 Pros, which spec-wise far outperform ID-Cooling's XF12025 ARGB fans, but this is at a significantly higher RPM and noise range. So the on-paper specs really don't help you understand what the coolers are actually like, which the thermal testing we will be doing a little later on will. And the fact that they're similar but the fans are different pretty much makes sense, right? As some of you may know, that most AIOs are actually made by the same company, Acertech. Companies such as NZXT, Corsair, Thermaltake, 90% of the time it's an Acertech cooler branded up and packaged with fans from the company that's selling it to you, the consumer. Which means that the only real performance difference between all of them is, well, which one has more capable fans. But actually this isn't true for either of these AIOs. Corsair have decided to use one of their other partners, Coolit, to manufacture the H100i Platinum. And ID-Cooling have stated that theirs is an in-house built and designed unit, which makes for a much more interesting comparison in my opinion, as there's actually meaningful differences between the two. One of the most interesting things that I noticed is while both AIOs are basically the same dimension, take a closer look at the radiators. The fin stack is substantially thicker on the H100i Platinum compared to the ZoomFlow 240x, and as they both have 19 fins per inch, this might be a significant way Corsair pulls ahead in relation to thermals. And you'll also notice that the tubing for the ZoomFlow is quite a bit thicker. I don't imagine that will have much of an impact on performance compared to increasing the volume of the fin stack, but it'll be interesting to find out. But let's get into category number 1, the looks of the two coolers. Obviously one is white and the other is black, so it is really unfair to compare that. But let's start with the design of the radiators. On the H100i Platinum, Corsair's logo is prominent and monochromatic. This is what I would consider to be a great implementation that will suit the majority of builds. ID-Cooling on the other hand have taken a different approach, with the ZoomFlow 240x being a subtle logo on a bold contrasting stripe, which is actually the same sticker for the black version, which makes it look even more subtle, which I really do like. But if I had to choose one, Corsair's implementation does look better to me. As for the rest of the radiator, it's a chunk of metal. Let's move on. The pump block on the H100i Platinum is significantly lower profile than most other AIOs on the market, including the ZoomFlow, and I really love a lower profile pump block. It just looks a lot less obtrusive when installed on a motherboard, as it doesn't tower over RGB memory modules. But, and this might just be me, but I think the design of the ZoomFlow does win me over. It is a little too reflective sometimes, and it can bounce light from certain angles, but the super thin ID-Cooling logo really does look super clean on the pump block compared to Corsair's logo. Thicker isn't always better, I think. But can we take a moment to discuss how ridiculous these cables are becoming? I typically really like Corsair products, but what the hell is that? A cable for the USB, a cable for the power, a cable for the fan RGB, a cable for the power for the fans. That's 4 batches of wires coming out the cable pump, and what makes it even worse is that it's from 2 different locations. I will give Corsair credit, as there are benefits to having everything connected to the pump block, which we will get into soon, but I at least want to know why the top cable cluster couldn't be sleeved or braided together. Even just 4 inches to get that Otto mess behind the motherboard tray, as one thicker cable is going to be a lot cleaner than that clusterfuck. And while I'm fixing this issue, please relocate that USB header on the pump block, above, below, next to the others. It really doesn't matter, but it would make it 2 cables from one location whilst keeping the same functionality. Okay, rant over, but bear in mind this is compared to the 2 far less noticeable cables coming off the ZoomFlow, which 2 could be braided together, and I'd love to see that in a future version. But in terms of fans, it's obvious that the Corsair ML120 Pro fans that come with the H100i Platinum are just more premium. The matte finish and the design look a lot less generic compared to the ZoomFlow XF ARGB fans, but that's not to say they look ugly, to be honest, just less pretty. And a couple areas that Corsair got absolutely right and ID-Cooling just didn't. I'm 100% going to be deducting points off the ZoomFlow for the marks on the radiator fittings. I appreciate that nobody's going to see them, so it's not a deal breaker, but I'm also not going to let it slide either. It seems sloppy, to be honest. And while I'm at it, the white on the ZoomFlow radiator is a very different white compared to the rest of the unit. This is actually a common issue with a lot of white PC parts, and I can't say if it's the same for white Corsair AIOs, but I'd imagine a company like Corsair would be a lot more meticulous about that sort of thing. Enough to get the right white on the radiator. Points will be deducted. So moving on to compatibility and installation, both the H100i Platinum and the ZoomFlow 240x are basically compatible with everything. And I'll throw a list on screen for you now while I talk you through the installation and my view of that process, which is expectedly very simple. The TLDR is put the corresponding screw through the correct hole, use the mounting hardware they tell you to, and screw it down. But the H100i Platinum does do this in a much more refined way, which will be reflected in the score. Let me show you. What you do is you line up the backplate nuts with the hole on the motherboard, and then you stick down the backplate to hold it in place, which is really well thought out in comparison to the ZoomFlow, which has you feeding long bolts through the motherboard whilst having you support everything on the other side. This just feels clumsy compared to the H100i Platinum. Another thing to mention is that the ZoomFlow 240x ARGB doesn't have thermal paste pre-applied. It's not too much of an issue, and some of you might even see it as a benefit, as they do give you enough for a couple uses, but it is something worth mentioning. Side note, one thing that I did really appreciate during the install is that ID-Cooling still used magnetic screws, even at this price point. I would 100% expect this from a premium product, but this tends to be one of those things that companies cut for a budget-focused product, and I hate that. I really would have deducted big points for not having these, so I'm really happy to see this. But in terms of connecting it all together, they're both pretty simple, to be honest. However, there are a couple key differences between them and important points that you should probably be aware of. The H100i Platinum requires an internal USB header, so make sure that you have one of those free, but I'll link a couple cool devices in the description if you need an extra one. Otherwise, it's just a case of plug in the power and everything else where labelled coming off the pump block. As for the ZoomFlow, it's a little less obvious. The 2 cables coming out the pump block are for the pump block's RGB and power. The power can be plugged in using the SATA adapter, or it can also be plugged into any motherboard fan header, but preferably the pump specific header next to the processor if you have one. The pump and the 2 fans use the typical 3-pin 50/50 header that simply connects to the included splitter cable. Fun fact, it also has a free header to add another device down the line, which is a really nice touch. But depending on how you want to control the lighting, the other end of the splitter either plugs directly into the motherboard or to the included controller. And all that's left is to attach the fans to the CPU fan header using the PWM splitter included. And that's everything up and running. As you can see, the ZoomFlow is a little less clean, but both of them are still pretty simple, to be honest. So let's move on to RGB and software control. We all know that the H100i Platinum is the clear winner here. If you've ever used Corsair iCUE, you know the vast control it gives you over your RGB, and its implementation with the H100i Platinum is no exception. Everything can be modified and controlled separately. Effects can be synchronized with other Corsair components using Lightlink. And you have a huge community that invests a ridiculous amount of man hours into custom effects. And this sense of full control absolutely cascades into the functionality of the H100i Platinum, with the immense amount of customizability not only over just the RGB, but the fans and the pump speed also, allowing you to set up custom profiles and apply them independently to each component. If you want the best control over your lighting and your speeds, this is absolutely it. The ZoomFlow, on the other hand, plugs directly into the motherboard to control the pump and the fan speed. So how this will behave and the control that you get over the pump and the fan curves will be dependent on your motherboard manufacturer. And as for lighting and control, of course the ZoomFlow doesn't get IQ support. Well, unless you saw that video up there, then you know that yes, it actually does, and you can get basically any standard addressable RGB device working with Corsair IQ extremely easily. So go watch that video if you didn't know, but it is unfair for me to grade it as if it has native support. So what does it have? Well, you actually get a couple options. Option number one is that you have your motherboard's RGB software control the ZoomFlow 240x. Whether you have Asus Aura, MSI Mystic Light, Gigabyte RGB Fusion or ASRock Polychrome, all that you need to do is plug in the fans and the pump block into your motherboard and control the lighting as if it's a connected addressable device. The effects that you can apply to the ZoomFlow and the control over those effects will be 100% dependent with the motherboard manufacturer you went with. MSI Mystic Light having the most effects, Asus and ASRock having the least, as I mentioned in that video right there. And I would definitely recommend this over the second option, which is using the included RGB controller. Don't get me wrong, the included controller actually doesn't suck, and if you want to see the effects in further detail, I'll drop a link to that video in the description for you. But the controller is really meant for those using motherboards without an addressable RGB header. So I think that we can all agree that the H100i Platinum wins this category by an absolute landslide, compared to what you get from motherboard manufacturers, and our scoring at the end will definitely reflect this. But which one is actually the better cooler? So let's get to testing before we recap and give both the H100i Platinum and the ZoomFlow 240x ARGB a rating and answer the question, which one deserves your money? So first, let's define what we're testing and how we're testing it. I'll be using my 6-core Intel i5 9600K on an MSI Z390 Gaming Edge AC motherboard, testing both stock and overclocked to 5 GHz to really push these guys a bit further and crown a performance winner. To do this properly, we're going to be setting the pump speed to 100% for both coolers, and testing in several different ways, recording temperature, fan rotation speed and noise output for a max fan speed test, giving us the best overall AIO, ignoring all other factors, a 40 decibel noise normalized test, giving us the best cooler at a given noise level, and then a fan normalized test with noctuas, showing us the best radiator pump combo if you wanted to replace the fans. So jumping into the max fan speed test, and while both coolers handled the heat extremely well, the H100i Platinum did manage to keep our stock 9600K 2.7 degrees cooler compared to the ZoomFlow. But as we increased the heat with a 5 GHz overclock, that gap did narrow to 1.8 degrees. However, this was pretty much expected as the H100i Platinum's fans are spinning over 50% faster than the ZoomFlows. Let's take a listen as to what 100% fan speed sounds like for both of these coolers. Yep, the H100i Platinum topped out at 49.4 dBA, which is significantly higher than the ZoomFlow 240x, which came in at 42.3 dBA. But having either of those coolers run full ham is not a fun time, blasting away beside you whilst you're trying to game or chill. So what happens when we noise normalize these to 40 dBA? Will the ID-Cooling come out on top? Well, not quite. As you can see from the results, they basically perform equally when noise normalized, with the slightest edge going to the H100i Platinum coming in 0.7 degrees cooler, which is potentially in margin of error territory. So the last thing that I do want to test is the pump and radiator combo. Essentially, are the results that we're seeing coming from the fans alone, and what happens when they use the same fans? So slapping on a pair of Noctua NF-S12B fans onto the coolers, and yes, for those of you in the know that have spotted, these are not pressure optimized fans meant for radiators. But fortunately, that doesn't really matter in these results, as the only thing that does matter is that they're the same fans for both coolers and who comes out on top, which is the H100i Platinum, as it manages to be nearly 1.5 degrees cooler at max fan speed, and when set up with a linear fan curve, it comes in 1.1 degrees cooler, running at a slightly lower fan speed. So the H100i Platinum does a slightly better job of moving that heat to the radiator and allowing the fans to dissipate it, which is probably and at least partially attributed to the higher volume fin stack of the H100i Platinum's radiator, which we saw earlier. So let us conclude Budget vs Beast episode 2. We're scoring the both coolers and concluding which one deserves your hard-earned cash. Recapping the looks category, I think the radiator and the fans on the H100i absolutely looks better, and the pump block being low profile is a really great design choice. Where points are deducted is primarily in the cable mess coming out the top of the pump block, which really should be rethought. As for the ZoomFlow, I think the design of the pump block is beautiful and I really do prefer the thicker tubes, but I really can't ignore the marks on the fittings and the off-color white on the radiator, which gives the Corsair a 4 and the ZoomFlow a 3. As for installation and compatibility, both coolers support every socket you're likely going to need them for, and the installation was easy for both of them. However, the H100i Platinum was a more refined and slightly clearer installation process, so I'm giving it a 5 out of 5 and the ZoomFlow a 4 out of 5. But moving on to RGB and control, I think it'd be crazy to not give the H100i Platinum a 5 out of 5 for this, with its integration into IQ being able to control pump speed, fan speed, and your lighting with incredible levels of granularity. But as for the ZoomFlow 240x, this is very much dependent on your motherboard and how you control the fan curve, pump, and RGB. But I am going to give it a 4 out of 5 for including a splitter for the RGB, including having a spare connector to plug into, a splitter for the PWM fan, and a controller for those who don't have an addressable RGB header. This has clearly had a decent amount of forethought put into it. And moving on to our last category, thermals and testing. I'm giving both coolers a 4 out of 5 in this category, as both of them perform pretty admirably, and although the H100i Platinum is better at cooling, it's only with a few degrees difference in it at the best of times, and god does it get so loud and obnoxious to do that. However, if you are looking to replace the fans and really push these coolers to the max, the H100i Platinum does come out a few degrees on top. But now to answer the question, which one deserves your money? As with most closed loop coolers, there's pretty minimal difference between them, so it all comes down to essentially 3 things. Which one do you prefer the look of? Are you absolutely sold on using Corsair IQ to control the pump speed and the fans? And is the Corsair one too loud for you? And while answering those questions, keep in mind that at the moment it's a $70 difference between the two. That's a 500GB M.2 NVMe drive right there. And if you didn't want to go with the H100i Platinum and you still wanted IQ to control your RGB, that's absolutely still doable even with the ZoomFlow, and I'll drop that video in the description for you. So it really does make it hard to recommend an option that's significantly more expensive and doesn't provide a substantial benefit over the budget option. But let me know in the comments below if you rate them the same based on what you've seen today. It'd be really interesting to get your opinion, and I'm pretty active down in the comments, so say hi at least. So if you enjoyed this episode, get subscribed, turn notifications on, and make sure that you don't miss the next Budget vs Beast on my upcoming Ncase M1 build. That's going to be the staple on the channel with many different revisions. Dual 240 rad tempered glass, anyone? It's going to take a bit of modding, but it seems doable. Otherwise, a like is always appreciated, and I'll see you in the next video.